Okay, so I spend a lot of time browsing the internet. Way too much time. And that means I come across a lot of exaggerations and falsehoods about history. It's easy to just accept them as truth when you see them repeated over and over again, but it gives you an incomplete view of the past. So here, I wanted to address 3 of these myths and misconceptions and explain what was actually going on. Number 1. Eleanor of Aquitaine murdered her husband's mistress. Eleanor was the wife and queen of Henry II of England from 1152 until his death in 1189. Before marrying Henry, she had been married to the King of France and was the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. Eleanor's independent position as Duchess, as well as her marriages, made her one of the most powerful women of her generation. Henry II and Eleanor were like-minded, strong-willed people who made for a formidable couple, but they became estranged over the years. Henry II had numerous affairs, which Eleanor seemed indifferent to, but according to legend, one of these mistresses so eclipsed Henry's affections that Eleanor became insanely jealous and killed her. This mistress was Rosamund Clifford. One story says that Henry II hid Rosamund in a labyrinth that he'd built for her, but Eleanor discovered it and confronted Rosamund. She then forced Rosamund to choose her own method of death, a dagger or a bowl of poison, and Rosamund chose the poison. This is actually the tame version. Another account claims that Eleanor had Rosamund stripped and roasted between 2 fires. She then left Rosamund to bleed to death in a scalding hot bath. It's the type of shit you'd expect to see in a Greek legend. Well, this is all utter nonsense. For one thing, Rosamund died in 1176, but the first account of a gruesome murder only popped up in the 14th century in the French Chronicle of London. You'd think a crime of Ted Bundy levels of evil would have been mentioned by somebody when this supposedly took place. I know sometimes people think it was impossible to criticise a medieval ruler, but that's simply not the case either. And if this actually happened, I doubt Henry would have gone to the trouble of protecting Eleanor's reputation by suppressing any literature on the matter. Talking specifically about the labyrinth, this would have been a large architectural undertaking, but there's no mention of Henry wasting a colossal amount of money on a crazy scheme in the 1100s. You can bet that Henry's subjects wouldn't have appreciated him using their taxes to cheat on his wife. There's also the matter of accessibility. You see, Henry II and Eleanor's son, Henry Jr., had a difficult relationship with his father. Resentful at his lack of power, Jr. started a revolt in 1173 against Henry II, and Eleanor egged on the youngest sons, Richard and Geoffrey, to join him in kicking their dad off the throne. The revolt failed in 1174, and Eleanor was imprisoned for her role and remained in custody for 16 years. So, what does this have to do with Rosamund, you may ask? Well, it was between 1174 and 1176 that Rosamund retired to a nunnery where she died. It's impossible for Eleanor to have gotten to Rosamund because her movements were so restricted during the early years of her captivity. Contact with the outside world was strictly forbidden, so it's impossible for Eleanor to have sent assassins, let alone murdered Rosamund with her bare hands. Eleanor was only allowed out on special occasions like Christmas, and even the little contact she had with her children was carefully monitored. Yeah, in practical terms, Eleanor couldn't have killed Rosamund even if she wanted to. Anyway, if Eleanor genuinely hated any mistress, it was most likely to have been Alice of France. By the way, Alice was the daughter of Eleanor's first husband from his later marriage. Medieval family trees are messy like that. Alice was arranged to marry Eleanor and Henry's son Richard in 1169, and was sent to live in England before the wedding. However, the marriage never came to pass, as Henry and Alice began an affair. And they weren't exactly discreet about it either. There were widespread rumours that Henry II intended to annul his marriage to Eleanor, and that Alice had given birth to his child. Chroniclers such as Gervase of Canterbury assert that Henry applied for an annulment from the Pope in 1175, but his request was denied, so Henry and Eleanor remained married until his death. For obvious reasons, Eleanor didn't want Alice marrying Richard anymore. Though Alice's brother had the cheek to suggest that Alice could still marry another of Eleanor's sons. No, Eleanor put her foot down and told them to shove it, so Alice left England to marry someone else. In conclusion, there's no evidence of Eleanor having murdered any of Henry II's mistresses, especially not Rosamund. It's an entertaining story, but that's all it is, just a story. Number 2. Ninja dressed head to toe in black. Ninjas were a type of lower-class warrior in feudal Japan who operated as spies and mercenaries. They were skilled in martial arts, but they specialized in covert tactics, such as planting misinformation, committing arson, and going undercover. In popular culture, they're depicted as wearing all black, but it was important for ninjas to blend into a crowd. And on most missions, dressing as a mysterious goth dude was going to draw unwanted attention. They probably would have dressed as regular peasants, traveling entertainers, or depending on the circumstance, as samurai. Thinking about it, it's of no surprise that fictional and legendary ninjas are often associated with the powers of shapeshifting and invisibility. The popular idea of the black ninja uniform is probably borrowed from the puppet handlers of bunraku theatre. Bunraku is a traditional Japanese puppet theatre which began in the 17th century. It uses half life-size dolls to act out dramatic narratives, and many of the stories focus on the conflict between the protagonist's own emotions and their social obligations. In order not to break the immersion of the audience, the puppet handlers dress in total black while they move puppets across the stage. The goth ninja look was also probably influenced by the stagehands in kabuki theatre, who likewise dress in all black. Kabuki is a heavily stylized form of Japanese dance drama, which originated around the same time as bunraku. It's recognizable from the beautiful elaborate costumes and detailed stage makeup. The stagehands change the scenery and occasionally play the role of animals. It would be a great way to demonstrate how a spy could be anywhere if someone you thought was a stagehand, someone you just accepted as part of the background, stepped forward and revealed themselves to be a ninja character the whole time. I remember as a kid watching an English dubbed episode of Pokemon, where James is physically forced to visit his parents and his friends move him like a puppet while dressed in black. Of course, they're not actually invisible, but James's parents act like they can't see anyone but James. Now as an adult I get the joke, but in a different way. They're obviously referencing bunraku or kabuki, which would have been clear to Pokemon's original Japanese audience. So yeah, the black ninja look is simply an artistic convention to demonstrate how ninjas could be hiding anywhere. Real ninjas would have dressed appropriately for whatever situation they were in. Number 3. That medieval people used Iron Maidens. When modern people think of medieval Europe, a lot of people associate it with creative torture devices. And they're not wrong. One of the most famous devices is the Iron Maiden, a metal sarcophagus with a hinged front and spike-covered interior, which is meant to kill the person who is close inside, via deep puncture wounds. Some pieces of fiction portray people being shut inside, and their tormentor moving the spikes further in each time the person refuses to confess to a crime. It's as horrible as you'd expect from most medieval things, but there's actually no mention of them during the Middle Ages. Wolfgang Schild, a professor of criminal law history, has argued that Iron Maidens that were exhibited in Victorian museums were pieced together from unrelated artifacts to create new exciting exhibitions. This wouldn't surprise me, considering there have been plenty of hoaxes and archaeological forgeries. For example, between 1915 and 1921, the Metropolitan Museum of Art purchased Etruscan terracotta warriors, ancient art forgeries that they didn't accept to be fake until 1961. It's also possible that the modern Iron Maiden is a misrepresentation of the barrel of shame, a German instrument of torture originating in the 13th century. The victim had to wear a wooden barrel, sometimes lined with sheet metal in public like a coat, to be jeered at by their neighbours for their misdeeds, sort of like a portable version of the stocks. Unlike the Iron Maiden, we can say for certain that the barrel of shame did in fact exist. The Iron Maiden is perhaps a misunderstanding of what the barrel of shame was actually used for. I suspect that this misunderstanding caused a type of self-fulfilling prophecy, where people started making Iron Maidens with a genuine belief that they used to be a real thing. So, don't get me wrong, torture was certainly used for centuries, but there were enough authentic torture devices available without people making up more. I guess it speaks to our morbid fascination with death and true crime, that humans need to imagine even more awful things to satisfy our curiosity. So, that's everything. Thank you to anyone who actually happens to see this and watches it. I hope it was at least somewhat informative.